For this month's block, you will find 15 white strips in your kit and 15 blue. You will also need the 15 square to square blocks we made a few months ago. The first thing we're going to do is subcut our white strips, and as usual, you can cut a stack of them if you want to. We're going to make 1.5 inch wide pieces. So if we say 1.5 times 2 is 3 inches, then what I want to do is trim my white strips down to 3-inch strips, 3 inches wide. I'm going to go ahead and clean cut one edge, and then rotate. And this time I am going to do the 3 inches and square it up on the line I clean cut down on this end. I'm not worrying about that end. Okay, so now I have my 3-inch piece. I'm going to go ahead and cut it into a 1.5 inch piece. And if you don't pick it up, then next we're going to cut off a 3.5 inch section, and you'll have to, I chipped my ruler, but it's still usable. So I'm lining up my 3.5 inch mark here, and I'm keeping one of my lines on the straight edge here. So 3.5 and cut. I can move those two out of the way, and then my last two pieces are going to be 5.5 inches long. So this time I'm lining up my 5.5 inch mark here and a straight line here and cut it off. So you're going to want those 4 pieces out of all 15 white strips. From our blue strips, we want 4 1 3/4 inch squares. So again, I'm going to just square up my strip on one long side and the short end. I'm going to rotate it, and this time I have done the math. 1 3/4 times 4 is 7 inches, so I'm trimming off to my 1 3/4 here, and then I'm going to cut it off at 7 inches long. And then 7 minus 1 3/4 is 5 1/4, so I'm going to back the ruler up to where it's 5 1/4 here. Keep my straight edges lined up with a line on the ruler. And then 5 1/4 minus 1 3/4 is going to be 3.5. And then 1 3/4 is my last cut. If you cut this way, then you're not running the risk of getting your first cut off at an angle as you go down, and you really don't have to pick up your squares like I did the first one. You can just keep moving the ruler, so it's a little bit faster, and it means you don't have to straighten your edge as often or at all. Once all the white pieces and blue pieces are cut up, you're ready to use your square and a square block that you made a few months ago. These square and a square blocks should have finished at 3.5 inches. If yours are bigger than that, you're going to want to trim them down. If they're a little bit smaller than that, then you could probably take a slightly narrower seam allowance. First thing we're going to do is sew one of the 3.5 by 1.5 inch pieces to opposite sides of our square and a square unit. When I'm stitching, I'm going to be stitching with the square and a square unit on top, because that way when I come down here, I can make sure I get my needle exactly in that intersection. I've stitched the 3.5 inch white strips to both sides of my square and a square blocks on all 15 of them, and I did chain piece. That just means I go down one side and then I come back and add the piece on the other side. I am matching the whites and the squares. You wouldn't have to. It can certainly be scrappy. When it comes to pressing, I pressed as sewn first, so just flat to set the seam, and then I pressed the seams out toward the white or away from the center. So the next step is to take the 5.5 inch strip, and I'm not going to take the time right now to find the one that matches, and sew it on the opposite sides. Oh, I got one. And I will match them. So actually here it is. And once again, I'm going to sew with the square and a square unit on top so that I can see this intersection when I'm sewing my 1/4 inch seam. Once again, I did chain piecing. As you can see, they're still attached here. I did one side and then came back and did the other. Once I had the last 2 rectangles sewn onto the opposite sides, I pressed the seam as sewn and then pressed it out away from the center, so it looks like this. Next, we're going to take all of the blue squares, and on the wrong side, mark a diagonal line from point to point. And that's just going to be one direction. I'm using a Frixion pen, which disappears with heat. But you can use anything you want to mark with, just so long as it doesn't shadow through to the other side. You don't want it to show. Once all our squares are marked, then we're going to add them to the corners of our block. So you're just going to place them with raw edges matching, and you want the line to go across the corner, not into the corner. And we're going to do that on all 4 sides. And then you're going to take it to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch, not exactly on the line, but just slightly inside the line, so towards the outside corner. That way you will have room for it to flip and actually go to the corner. So once it's stitched, it's going to flip like this. So we're going to just stitch just inside the line on all of them. Oh, I am not matching my blue outside squares to what was on the square and a square. I don't think you even have the right number in your kit to do that. It's going to be more interesting if they're not all matchy-matchy. I have stitched my squares to all the corners, and I'm hoping if I zoom in, you can see that I sewed just a little bit towards the outside corner away from the line. What you want is when you flip it for it to go all the way to the outside corner. If it goes a little slightly beyond, I'm not that concerned about it because I can always trim it down. So I would recommend that you do 1 or 2. Make sure that where you're lining your stitching up is getting the top part of the square when you fold it over to go all the way to the edge. When you're satisfied with that, then go ahead and sew them onto all the blocks. Once you have sewn them, we are going to next trim down our seam allowance. You could use scissors because it's not vital that it be exactly 1/4 inch, but we're leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance on here. And then we're going to press the triangles out away from the center. These are a few of my finished blocks. You will need 15 in all, and I can admit mine are not exactly perfect. They are close to 5.5 inches, and they will do.